A train rushing through the night. The clatter of the wheels, the hum of whispered secrets, and the heavy air thick with tension. But in one compartment a deadly game is unfolding, a game that no one on board knows they are part of, yet. A brilliant mind, sharp as a blade, is closing in on the truth, but so is a murderer who will stop at nothing to keep their dark secrets buried. Tonight, one will outwit the other. The question is who will be the last one standing. The last stop on the Orient Line train gleamed brightly in the early morning sun, casting long shadows across the grand station in Istanbul. The station buzzed with the energy of passengers arriving and departing, porters shouting instructions and the rhythmic hiss of steam from the engine, mingling with the distant hum of the city beyond. The sleek green carriages of the train, polished to perfection, stood in stark contrast to the cobblestone platform, promising an escape into a world of refinement and elegance. Agatha Marple, a woman of unassuming stature but piercing intellect, stood silently among the bustling crowd, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with quiet curiosity. Dressed in an elegant yet understated traveling suit, she carried only a small leather bag, modest, but undeniably well crafted, its contents known only to her. The air around her was thick with anticipation, a sense that something was about to unfold, though she had yet to determine what that might be. The station was a cacophony of voices, the sound of people hurrying to catch the train, the soft clatter of suitcase wheels, and the sharp calls of station attendants. As the final bell sounded, and the train slowly began to pull away from the station, the city of Istanbul began to blur, fading into the distance as the Orient Line steamed onward toward its destination. Agatha, however, stood on the precipice of something far more important, her quiet contemplation of the scene, overshadowed by the knowledge that something was amiss. As she made her way aboard, Agatha was greeted by the uniformed steward who guided her through the narrow corridors of the train. The interior of the train was a marvel of old-world luxury. Polished wood paneling adorned the walls, inlaid with brass accents, while plush carpets muffled her footsteps. The air was scented with a delicate mix of fresh coffee and leather upholstery. Every corner, every detail, was a reflection of a bygone era. Agatha's compartment, though small, was exquisitely appointed, with velvet drapes framing the window, and a vase of fresh flowers placed delicately on the table in front of her. She settled into her seat, her gaze wandering to the other passengers filing past. Each one seemed to carry a story, their faces etched with quiet narratives waiting to be unraveled. A young woman, her eyes darting nervously from side to side, clutched a book in her hands as if it were a lifeline. An older gentleman, his features sharp with the marks of age and wisdom, glanced at his pocket watch impatiently, and a glamorous couple bedecked in jewels and fine clothing, whispered quietly in French, their words hushed and intimate. Agatha, posing as a historian, was determined to discover the stories behind their faces. As the train lurched forward and began its journey into the countryside, the world outside transformed into a blur of sunlit domes and crowded streets, but within the train, the true drama was just beginning to unfold. The dining car of the Orient Line was a spectacle of opulence, its crystal chandeliers casting a warm golden light over the polished mahogany tables, each set with the finest china and gleaming silverware. The atmosphere was hushed yet charged with anticipation, as passengers dined in refined silence beneath the watchful eyes of uniformed waiters who moved with practiced grace. Agatha, seated near the center of the car, observed the room with a quiet intensity. Her unobtrusive presence allowed her to take in every detail, every subtle shift in body language, every whispered word. Her attention was drawn to Dr. Peral Harrington, a tall man with a booming voice that seemed to command the very air around him. He sat at the head of a table, regaling his captivated audience with tales of his latest expedition to the deserts of Egypt. His white mustache quivered with excitement as he spoke of an artifact, a relic unlike any other, its craftsmanship, suggesting that it predated all known history. As he spoke, a ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some of the listeners were visibly enraptured by his work, their faces reflecting awe and curiosity, yet not all were as captivated. Dr. Evelyn Monteague, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, tapped her fork against her plate in quiet irritation. Beside her sat Sir Julian Blake, a stout man with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. His gaze was fixed on Harrington, though there was a subtle, almost imperceptible tension in his posture. "I suppose you've brought this wonder with you, Dr. Harrington?" Sir Julian asked, his voice light, yet edged with something darker, something unspoken. "Must be quite a sight to behold." Harrington's chest puffed with pride, his voice rising dramatically. "Indeed, Sir Julian, I would not dream of leaving such a treasure unattended. But I must warn you all," he added, lowering his voice and casting a furtive glance around the table, "this artifact comes with a history, one of misfortune, some might even say it's cursed." The words hung in the air, and a ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the dining car. Madame Dubos, a striking woman draped in expensive jewelry, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with interest. "Cursed, you say? How deliciously ominous," she remarked, her voice laced with a thrill that sent a chill through the room. Agatha, ever watchful, noted the faint flicker of unease that crossed Dr. Monteague's face, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if she had heard the tale before. But it was the look in Sir Julian's eyes that intrigued Agatha the most, a mixture of skepticism and something darker, something deeper. As the conversation continued, Agatha's mind raced, her historian's instinct telling her that there was far more to this artifact than anyone was letting on. And with that knowledge, she braced herself for the unraveling mystery that lay ahead, for she was certain that this train, with all its elegance and opulence, was about to become the stage for a story far more intricate, far more dangerous than anyone aboard could imagine. "Superstition, nothing more," Dr. Monteague interjected briskly, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. "Science deals in facts, not fairy tales." But Harrington, his eyes gleaming with an unspoken certainty, was unfazed. "History," he began, his voice rising with dramatic "is riddled with curses, Dr. Monteague, just as it is riddled with greed, betrayal, and murder." His words hung in the air, heavy and insistent, settling like a shadow that refused to be shaken. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of his statement pressing down on the gathered guests. Agatha, ever the observer, sipped her tea, her mind already weaving the complex web of relationships and motives around her. Professional rivalries, old alliances, whispered rumors of a cursed artifact. She had come aboard the Orient Express seeking to uncover secrets of the past, but it was clear that what she would uncover was far more dangerous than any historical relic. As the conversation resumed, the tension lingered, thick and palpable. Agatha's sharp eyes swept the room, noting the subtle flickers of resentment in Dr. Monteague's eyes, the calculating tilt of Sir Julian Blake's head, and the barely contained glee dancing on Dr. Harrington's face. The artifact may have been the focal point of their discussion, but it was the players surrounding him who truly intrigued Agatha. Each person held a piece of the puzzle, and as the train pressed on, so too did the mystery unfurl, layer by layer. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels seemed to mirror the ticking of an invisible clock, each turn of the wheel bringing them closer to something unforeseen. By the time the train had cut through the rolling hills of the Turkish countryside, Agatha had already decided that this journey was not merely about history, it was a journey into the hearts of the people aboard. Dinner proved as illuminating as she had hoped. Dr. Harrington, seated at the far end of the car, held court, his booming voice drawing chuckles and murmurs of interest from his rapt audience. "This artifact," he said, raising his wine glass for emphasis, "is not only genuine, but unparalleled in its significance. The craftsmanship, the detail, it could only have been the work of a civilization far older than we dare to imagine." Madame Dubos, seated nearby, tilted her head slightly, her red lips curling into a smile that was at once gracious and sharp. "Indeed, Dr. Harrington," she replied, her voice honeyed, yet edged with suspicion. "And yet I cannot help but wonder where exactly was this extraordinary find unearthed. It sounds almost too good to be true." For a moment, the room fell silent. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Harrington's smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly, raising his chin defiantly. "The location of the find must remain undisclosed for now, Madame Dubos," he said, his tone now colder, more guarded. "The academic world is rife with opportunists, as I'm sure you understand." Madame Dubos leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady, almost predatory. "Of course," she replied, her tone dripping with honeyed politeness, though her eyes betrayed a growing curiosity that could not be concealed. "But I imagine such an artifact would attract many eager minds, wouldn't it?" Her words hung in the air, unspoken implications running thick beneath the surface. Agatha's eyes flickered between the two, sensing the underlying currents of tension that had nothing to do with the artifact itself. The piece of history at the center of their discussion was nothing more than a catalyst, sparking a fire that had already begun to burn in the hearts of those around the table. The conversation shifted again, but Agatha's mind was no longer focused solely on the words being spoken. Her attention was on the subtle gestures, the unspoken alliances, and the small flickers of emotion that betrayed far more than anyone realized. There was something far darker at play here, something that none of these passengers were ready to acknowledge. The artifact was not merely an object, it was a symbol, a trigger, and Agatha was certain that it would not be long before the mysteries of this train began to reveal themselves in ways that no one could have anticipated. The last stop on the Orient Line had only just begun, but Agatha knew, with chilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. "Complications, none that would concern us, Dr. Harrington replied with a casual wave, though his voice carried a trace of something darker beneath the polished surface. "There are no questions of provenance perhaps at this point, only the undeniable wonder of the find itself." As his words hung in the air, a subtle shift passed through the dining car. Dr. Evelyn Monteague, seated beside him, shifted uncomfortably, her fingers briefly tightening around the stem of her water glass. Her knuckles whitened, a fleeting gesture that spoke volumes, but she quickly regained her composure, glancing toward Harrington with a practiced smile. Agatha noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, cataloguing it in her mind with a quiet precision that made her the most dangerous person in the room. Sir Julian Blake, sitting across from them, leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering with keen interest, though his face betrayed nothing. His posture remained relaxed, but there was something about his gaze that suggested he was waiting for something more to be revealed. Harrington, seemingly unbothered by the tension that had begun to creep into the room, let out a hearty laugh, his booming voice cutting through the silence. "The only complication, madame," he said, turning his gaze around the room, "is the artifact's ability to inspire awe, and perhaps a touch of envy." His eyes lingered for a moment longer on Monteague and Blake, a pointed look that suggested there were deeper currents at play. "But then again," he added with a sly smile, "jealousy has always been the shadow of greatness, hasn't it?" Madame Dubos, who had been sitting quietly until then, leaned forward, her red lips curling into a smile that was both predatory and elegant. "How fascinating," she said softly, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "And is it true, Dr. Harrington, that this relic is said to be cursed?" The word curse floated through the air, lingering like an echo, and a collective shiver seemed to ripple through the gathered guests. Agatha watched as a flicker of irritation passed across Harrington's face, but it was gone before anyone could catch it. "The curse?" Harrington chuckled, dismissing the notion with a wave of his hand. "Merely superstition, I assure you. A relic of this magnitude, one that commands such admiration, is bound to inspire wild tales. It's the hallmark of human imagination," he said, his tone lightly mocking. But Dubos, never one to let a provocation slide, leaned back in her chair, her fingers toying absently with her wineglass as her gaze shifted to Monteague. "Superstition, yes, And yet, she continued, her voice dropping to a more conspiratorial tone, superstition often begins with a grain of truth, does it not? Agatha's sharp eyes flicked to Montague, who had now begun dabbing at her lips with a napkin, her movements stiff and deliberate. Sir Julian, for his part, appeared to suppress a smirk, though the amusement in his eyes was unmistakable. The undercurrents of tension were growing thicker with every word, and Agatha could feel the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. It was at that moment that Harrington, perhaps sensing the delicate balance of the room, boomed once more. "Quite enough of this talk of curses," he declared, his voice lifting in a forced cheer. "Let us raise a toast, not to superstition but to the triumphs of human discovery and the indomitable spirit of exploration." Crystal glasses clinked around the table, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to relax, as if the toast had successfully quelled the mounting tension. Agatha, however, remained vigilant. As she sipped her wine, her mind continued to piece together the fragments of conversation she had observed, Madame Dubos's challenging tone, the barely contained agitation of Dr. Montague, and the detached amusement of Sir Julian Blake. Each word, each glance, each carefully chosen gesture spoke of histories that had yet to be unveiled, of motivations far more complex than any of them were willing to admit. The train pressed on, its wheels clattering steadily as the night outside deepened into inky blackness. Inside the dining car, however, the shadows of greed, envy, and ambition loomed just as darkly as the night beyond. Agatha Marple, ever the watchful observer, knew that these shadows would only grow deeper as the journey continued. The last stop on the Orient Line was far from over, and as the conversation swirled around her, Agatha's mind worked tirelessly to connect the threads. Each person had something to hide, and it was only a matter of time before the weight of their secrets would crash into one another, unraveling the fragile web of civility they had so carefully spun. The true journey had yet to begin, and Agatha was more certain than ever that this train ride would lead to revelations no one would see coming. The dining car, bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, hummed with the sound of clinking glasses and polished conversation, a testament to the legendary reputation of the Orient Express. At the center of it all, Dr. Percival Harrington presided over his table with an air of indulgence, his booming voice regaling his companions with grand tales of ancient treasures and archaeological triumphs. His laughter, loud and infectious, rippled through the room, commanding the attention of everyone within earshot. "I assure you," he declared, his mustache twitching with amusement, "the dig was treacherous, but one does not unearth history's secrets by playing it safe." As he raised his glass to punctuate his statement, his expression suddenly faltered. His smile faded, replaced by confusion as he blinked rapidly, his face flushing crimson. A violent cough racked his body, interrupting his words, and the room fell into stunned silence. Agatha's sharp eyes watched with calculating precision as Harrington clutched at his chest, his breathing growing more erratic. His movements, once animated, now turned frantic, fingers clawing desperately at the tablecloth. The scene unfolded with chilling clarity, his body spasmed uncontrollably before collapsing with a heavy thud, sending glasses and plates crashing to the floor. A strangled scream tore through the air as passengers leapt from their seats in a frenzy, the sound of scraping chairs filling the tense atmosphere. Agatha, however, remained unmoved. Her gaze never wavered from the figure slumped at the center of the table, her expression unreadable, but her mind racing. The train's conductor rushed into the car, followed closely by a steward, and the ship's doctor, a composed man with silver hair. The doctor knelt beside Harrington, his fingers moving efficiently to check for signs of life. After a tense, agonizing moment, he straightened, his expression grim. "He's dead," he confirmed, and the dining car erupted into chaos. While panic and fear gripped most of the passengers, Agatha remained cool and detached, her eyes scanning the room with quiet precision. It wasn't the spectacle of Harrington's death that intrigued her, it was the reactions of those around her. Dr. Evelyn Montague stood frozen, her hands gripping the back of her chair, her face pale yet composed. Madame Dubois, ever the picture of elegance, placed a hand delicately over her mouth, her wide eyes betraying a genuine shock. Sir Julian Blake, on the other hand, seemed less distraught and more calculating, his eyes sweeping the room with a peculiar intensity, as if searching for something, or someone. The conductor, his voice steady but firm, attempted to calm the panicked crowd. "Please everyone, return to your seats. We will sort this out in due course." His command, though authoritative, failed to quell the growing unease in the room. As the chaos subsided, a steward hurried in, whispering urgently to the conductor. The man's face tightened as he addressed the passengers once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask for your patience. A search of Dr. Harrington's cabin has revealed that a small but highly valuable artifact is missing." A collective gasp swept through the room, the air thick with tension. Madame Dubois, her voice sharp and laced with suspicion, was the first to speak. "Stolen?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Surely not." The conductor's response was terse but unwavering. "I regret to say it appears so. The artifact was of significant historical importance." Agatha's mind raced as she observed the subtle ripple of unease that passed through the room. The missing artifact, combined with Harrington's sudden death, had cast a thick shadow over the proceedings. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, and Agatha knew that this was only the beginning. The secrets hidden within this train would not stay buried for long. As the train hurtled through the night, its rhythmic clattering of wheels seemed to echo the pounding pulse of tension that now thrummed throughout the dining car. Agatha Marple, ever composed, sat at her table, her mind already weaving the first threads of the complex puzzle that lay before her. Her sharp eyes flicked over the assembled passengers, noting each subtle shift of body, the quickened breaths, and the wariness that lingered in the air. The conductor's voice broke the uneasy stillness, calling for the attention of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone firm and practiced. "I must inform you that the cabin doors were locked during dinner service, as is our policy, to ensure passenger safety, while our staff tends to the meal preparations." A murmur of confusion rippled through the passengers. Sir Julian Blake, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "Locked cabins?" he questioned, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Seems like an excessive precaution." The conductor responded evenly, his voice unwavering. "It is the train's policy. This means that no one could have entered or exited Dr. Harrington's compartment during the meal, yet the artifact is missing." Madame Dubois, with her ever-elegant demeanor, quickly pointed out, her voice laced with disbelief. "How do you explain that?" Agatha's voice, cool yet piercing, cut through the rising din. "The implication is clear, madame. If the doors were locked, the theft, and possibly the murder, must have been committed by someone seated here, in this very room." A thick silence enveloped the dining car. Eyes darted nervously, faces pale as passengers exchanged furtive glances, each person aware of the weight of suspicion hanging in the air. Agatha, her expression calm and unreadable, glanced briefly toward Dr. Harrington's body, which lay motionless under a hastily thrown tablecloth. Her eyes scanned the room again, noting every minute movement, the twitch of a hand, the shift of a gaze. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening like the mist outside. The train rocked gently, but it did little to quell the fear that had now taken root in the hearts of those aboard. Agatha Marple remained seated, her demeanor unshaken, her mind working at lightning speed. The truth, she knew, was buried not in the details of Dr. Harrington's death, but in the tangled web of human motives that lay just beneath the surface. Her gaze shifted to the lounge car, a sanctuary of calm in the growing storm. The rich mahogany walls and the soft glow of antique lamps created an atmosphere of quiet sophistication, a stark contrast to the growing unease elsewhere. Agatha sat unobtrusively near a window, the faint rhythm of the train's movement the only sound breaking the silence. As she knitted absent-mindedly, her thoughts swirled. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, hidden beneath layers of deception and carefully guarded secrets. Her first stop was Dr. Evelyn Montague, who sat in a far corner, her sharp features betraying no emotion as she leafed through a book. Agatha approached, her presence soft yet commanding. "Such a terrible business," Agatha said, her voice low and thoughtful. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. You must be quite shaken." Montague looked up, her expression briefly flickering with surprise before she composed herself. "Not at all," she replied coolly, her voice sharp. "It's unfortunate, but Dr. Harrington wasn't exactly a man who inspired much warmth." Agatha's eyebrow quirked, feigning surprise. "Oh, I had thought the two of you were colleagues." "We were," Montague replied, her words clipped, "but that term implies a level of respect that was sorely lacking. Dr. Harrington had a habit of appropriating the work of others and passing it off as his own. That earned him more enemies than I care to count." Agatha's knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she processed this information. "Enemies indeed," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "I trust your own work didn't suffer too much under his shadow." Montague's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The silence between them spoke volumes, the unspoken tension thickening the air between them. It was clear that there was much more to this tangled web of relationships than Montague was willing to reveal. Agatha leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the possibilities. Every interaction, every slight glance, every carefully chosen word seemed to carry more weight than it should have. There was more to this than simple jealousy or rivalry. The murder of Dr. Harrington was a deliberate, calculated act, and the missing artifact, it was the key to unraveling everything. Agatha's mind was a whirlwind of calculations and deductions as she observed the passengers around her. The weight of the unfolding mystery pressed heavily on her, but she was careful not to show it. She had not missed the subtle tension between Dr. Montague's stiff composure and her thinly veiled disdain for Dr. Harrington. "I do hope your work didn't suffer too greatly under his shadow," Agatha had remarked, her words gentle but laced with quiet curiosity. Montague's lips had thinned, her eyes narrowing slightly, but her silence had been the loudest answer, more revealing than any confession could have been. With that piece of the puzzle in place, Agatha shifted her attention to Sir Julian Blake, who was seated at the bar, his once amiable persona replaced by a somber mask. He was swirling a glass of brandy in his hands, lost in thought. Agatha slid onto the stool beside him, her presence almost imperceptible, like a passing breeze. "Quite the tragedy," she said softly, her voice a delicate thread in the otherwise tense atmosphere. "Dr. Harrington must have been a difficult man to work with." Blake chuckled, but it lacked humor. "That's putting it mildly, Miss Marple," he said, his voice heavy with disdain. "Harrington was a genius, no doubt, but with the financial acumen of a child, always promising more than he could deliver, constantly biting off more than he could chew. It's a miracle he lasted as long as he did." Agatha's gaze never wavered as she pressed on, her tone light but probing. "Ah, so you were his financial backer." Blake's smirk deepened. "Guilty as charged, though I suppose it wasn't so much backing as bailing him out over and over again. Harrington was deep in debt, you see. Very deep. How unfortunate," Agatha murmured, her mind spinning as she processed this new detail. "Did he owe you much?" Blake finished his drink with a quick motion. "Enough," he said cryptically, his eyes dark with bitterness. "Enough to make me wish I'd never met him." Meanwhile in the lounge car, Madame Dubois sat as a picture of elegance, her gloved fingers delicately cradling a cigarette holder, her gaze distant as she watched the passing landscape blur into darkness. Agatha approached, but when the Frenchwoman turned to greet her, her smile was poised and practiced. "Miss Marple," she said smoothly, her tone warm but distant, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Agatha's response was measured, her tone calm but edged with intent. "I wouldn't call it a pleasure, madam. This dreadful business with Dr. Harrington, weighs heavily on us all. I thought to distract myself with a bit of conversation. Dubois let out a faint amused laugh, exhaling a plume of smoke. A wise choice, though I must admit, she said, her voice lowering, my thoughts are hardly far from the matter. Dr. Harrington's dealings were not always above reproach. Agatha leaned in, her curiosity piqued. What sort of dealings? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. Dubois's smile turned sharp, her eyes glinting with something more than mere amusement. Harrington's ambitions extended beyond academia, you see, she replied, her tone laden with disdain. He had a taste for the exotic, particularly artifacts of questionable provenance. It's no secret in certain circles that he engaged with the black market to acquire them. Agatha's knitting needles paused mid-click. Surely not, she murmured, her tone neutral but laced with disbelief. Surely so, Dubois answered smoothly, her smile turning almost predatory. The artifact in his possession, what do they call it? The cursed idol was a prize, certainly, but one he might have paid dearly for, and not just in coin. Agatha's mind raced as she processed this information. A man with secrets, debts and enemies, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. No wonder he seemed larger than life. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. The mystery of Dr. Harrington's death, and the missing artifact, was beginning to unravel, but the deeper Agatha dug, the more intricate and dangerous it became. Larger than life perhaps, Dubois said, her fingers elegantly crushing the cigarette into the ashtray, a gesture that spoke of dismissal more than disdain. But like all men, mortal in the end. The words hung in the air, their weight settling heavily in the dimly lit lounge car, as the train cut through the darkening Anatolian countryside, its wheels humming steadily against the tracks. Agatha Marple sat alone once more, her knitting needles moving rhythmically with the silent procession of her thoughts. Each of her passengers, each of their motives, Montague's quiet resentment, Blake's bitter financial grievances, Dubois's veiled knowledge of the black market, woven into a tapestry of intrigue, pulling tighter and tighter, revealing more complexity with each passing moment. Somewhere in that labyrinth of suspicion and secrets, the truth waited to be uncovered, and Agatha knew it would take little more than patience to unravel it. The train's lights flickered softly as it sped towards its next destination, and with the setting sun casting a golden glow across the windows of the observation car, Agatha turned her attention back to Dr. Evelyn Montague, who sat before her, reluctantly folding the corners of the mystery together. It's called the Idol of Kadesh, Montague said, her voice as crisp and controlled as the starched collar of her blouse. A small carved figure, no more than 6 inches tall. Dr. Harrington claimed it was recovered from a temple site in Syria, though, she paused, her lips pressing tightly together, as if holding back something more than just words. There's no way to verify that claim. Agatha's sharp gaze missed nothing, catching the brief flicker of bitterness in Montague's expression. You doubt its authenticity? She asked, her voice soft but insistent. Montague's sigh was audible, frustration seeping through the cracks of her composure. Harrington was more showman than scholar, she replied, her words clipped but pointed. He knew how to captivate an audience, but his methods were dubious at best. The idol's provenance is suspect, to say the least. She let the words linger, their implications hanging heavy between them. And then, Montague added with a slight grimace, there's the matter of the so-called curse. Agatha's eyes flickered with interest. The curse, she echoed, her voice a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Montague waved her hand dismissively, but there was a shadow in her eyes. Superstitious nonsense, she said, as if the very mention of it was beneath her. The idol is said to bring misfortune to anyone who possesses it. Harrington loved to embellish such tales. It made his discoveries more marketable. Agatha's gaze sharpened. But you don't believe in the curse? She pressed, her tone gentle yet probing. Montague's lips curled into a tight smile. "Of course not," she replied firmly. "But curses have a way of attracting trouble, especially when artifacts like this one end up in the wrong hands. Collectors, dealers, criminals. It's a sordid business, one Harrington knew all too well." Agatha nodded slowly, her mind working quickly as she absorbed the implications of Montague's words. The idol, with its dubious origins and the question of its authenticity, painted a portrait of a man who had thrived on spectacle, but also of one whose greed and penchant for deception had led him into murky, dangerous waters. But there was more, a shadow beneath the surface. "Thank you, Dr. Montague," Agatha said, offering a faint smile. "You've been most helpful." As Montague returned to her cabin, Agatha remained in the observation car, her thoughts circling the idol like a hawk in search of its prey. A cursed artifact, a murder, a missing relic. Too many pieces of the puzzle were missing. But one detail stood out, as clear as the sunset outside. If Harrington had possessed the idol, where was it now? And had it even been the real artifact to begin with? The corridor outside Sir Julian Blake's cabin was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the train's engine. Agatha paused just outside the door, her gloved hand hovering over the brass handle, weighing her options. Blake had excused himself earlier, claiming a headache, and Agatha suspected he wouldn't be returning any time soon. The timing was perfect, a rare opportunity that she couldn't afford to waste. Her heart quickened as she gently pushed the door open, her mind already calculating the risks and rewards of what she might find inside. The cabin was tastefully furnished, minimalistic yet undeniably elegant, a space befitting a man of Sir Julian Blake's considerable stature. It was the kind of room that spoke of wealth and good taste without being ostentatious, with muted tones and polished furniture. Agatha Marple moved silently through the space, her every step measured, her eyes darting over the room, alert to any detail that might seem out of place. Her instincts were finely tuned, honed by years of unraveling mysteries, and it didn't take long for her to spot it. A small drawer in the writing desk was slightly ajar, and inside, hidden among neatly stacked papers, lay a glass vial. Its stopper was absent, and as Agatha picked it up, she held it up to the light, her sharp eyes scanning the residue at the bottom. It was faint but unmistakable, poison. Her pulse quickened as the implications set in. Poison had been used, no doubt, but her mind immediately began to pick apart the scene. It felt almost too convenient, too perfectly placed. Sir Julian Blake was a man of considerable intelligence. He wouldn't be so careless as to leave such an incriminating clue lying in plain sight, unless of course he wanted someone to find it. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line as she replaced the vial carefully back into the drawer, her mind whirring with questions. Why would someone leave such a damning piece of evidence so easily accessible? Was this part of some larger game? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint creak behind her, a sound so subtle that it sent a chill down her spine. Agatha's body tensed, every sense on high alert as she swiftly turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was Madame Dubois, her expression a mask of cool amusement. "Miss Marple," she said smoothly, stepping into the room with the grace of someone who had long mastered the art of elegance. "I didn't take you for the snooping type." Agatha offered her a polite smile, but inwardly her mind was racing. She had been caught, but she wasn't about to give up any ground. "Curiosity, madam," she replied evenly, her tone smooth and controlled. "It's a habit of mine." Dubois's gaze flickered momentarily toward the writing desk, a subtle glint of something amusement, or perhaps something darker, flashing in her eyes before her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "How true," she murmured. "But be careful, Miss Marple. Curiosity can be dangerous." With those cryptic words, Dubois turned on her heel and swept out of the room, leaving Agatha standing there, alone with her thoughts once more. The vial of poison, was it real, or just another part of a carefully crafted ruse? That question gnawed at Agatha as she stood still in the room, her thoughts swirling. One thing was certain, however, the game was far from over. It was only just beginning, and Agatha was determined to be the one to untangle the web of lies and deceit before it was too late. Later the train continued its journey, cutting through the mountains with the landscape outside veiled in a soft, misty haze. In the first-class lounge, Agatha sat at a small table near the corner, seemingly absorbed in her knitting. The rhythmic click of the needles blended seamlessly with the soft hum of whispered conversations that filled the room. Yet Agatha was not knitting for pleasure. Her sharp ears caught every word exchanged between Sir Julian Blake and Madame Dubois. Their voices were hushed, their conversation low but charged with an energy that spoke volumes. Dubois's tone was controlled, while Blake's responses were sharp, his usual joviality replaced by something more guarded, more wary. The tension between them was palpable, and Agatha knew that whatever they were discussing, it was important. She could feel the weight of the conversation as she listened, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to click into place. When Dubois finally excused herself and made her exit, Agatha rose from her seat with purpose. There was no time to waste. This was her moment. She moved swiftly to catch up with the woman who had just left the lounge, her footsteps light but determined. The glow of the brass sconces cast long soft shadows along the hallway, and Agatha's mind raced with the possibilities. What game was Madame Dubois playing? Was she a mere bystander in this drama, or was she something more, a player with her own hidden agenda? As Agatha followed Dubois down the narrow hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would hold the key to unraveling the entire mystery. Every instinct told her that the answers lay just out of reach, but with every step, Agatha was one step closer to discovering the truth. It was a game of strategy, of wits, and Agatha was determined to outmaneuver everyone else on board the Orient Line. She had no illusions. This would not be easy. But then again, nothing worth solving ever was. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around her, and as the train moved steadily toward its destination, Agatha Marple was ready to put them together. "Stride, Madame Dubois," Agatha began, her voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable edge of intrigue. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word." Dubois paused, her brow arching ever so slightly, as if she could sense the subtle shift in the air. "Miss Marple, you do have a talent for finding me at the most curious times," she replied, her tone cool but not unkind. Agatha offered a polite smile, her expression unchanging. "Curiosity is a habit of mine, I'm afraid," she said softly, a glimmer of something sharper beneath the words. Dubois considered her for a moment, her gaze steady before nodding. "Very well," she said, her voice smooth like silk. "Shall we speak here, or would you prefer somewhere more private?" "The lounge will suffice," Agatha replied, gesturing with a small but purposeful movement for them to return to their seats. Once seated, Agatha leaned in slightly, her demeanor disarming yet purposeful. She began with the same warmth that had served her well in so many conversations before, her tone casual yet pointed. "Madame Dubois, I've been reflecting on Dr. Harrington's sudden death, such an unfortunate loss, particularly given the artifact he was transporting." Dubois's expression remained composed, though there was a slight tightening of her fingers on the edge of her chair. "It is tragic, of course," she said, her voice measured, though something in her gaze flickered. "Though if I may say, his reputation wasn't entirely unblemished." Agatha's smile was barely perceptible, a small curve of her lips that hinted at something more. "Indeed," she agreed smoothly, her tone not missing a beat. "I've heard whispers that he intended to sell the artifact upon reaching Paris. Quite a lucrative endeavor, I would imagine." Dubois's lips twitched, curling into a smile that never reached her eyes. "The art world is rife with temptation, Miss Marple. I'm sure you understand that such rumors are common." Agatha nodded thoughtfully, but her next words were sharper, more deliberate. "Oh, I understand, but I also understand you've had dealings with the collector Roland Vase." His reputation in certain circles is colorful, to say the least. Dubois's composure faltered for just a fraction of a second. Her gaze narrowed ever so slightly, and Agatha felt the shift, the moment when the carefully constructed mask began to slip. "You are well informed," Dubois remarked, her tone still calm though tinged with something else, perhaps surprise or wariness. Agatha's smile deepened, not with pleasure, but with the satisfaction of a woman who had just placed the first piece of a complex puzzle into place. "One must be when traveling in such esteemed company," she replied smoothly, her gaze unwavering. "Tell me, madame," she continued, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret, "do you think it possible that Dr. Harrington's death was less about rivalry or jealousy, and more about securing his treasure for another buyer?" Dubois leaned back in her chair, her fingers now perfectly still, betraying no hint of the tension that had briefly appeared. "That Missmarple would depend entirely on who stood to benefit," she said softly, her voice laced with an almost imperceptible edge. Agatha nodded, satisfied that the seed of doubt had been planted. Watching the briefest flicker of unease in Dubois' eyes, she allowed the conversation to drift to safer, more neutral topics, but the look they exchanged as they parted spoke volumes. Madame Dubois was hiding something, and Agatha was closer than ever to uncovering it. Later that evening, Agatha found herself seated across from Dr. Evelyn Monteague in the dining car. The two women spoke in hushed tones, their conversation masked by the soft hum of other diners. Agatha's voice, though soft, carried an undercurrent of urgency. "I must ask for your assistance, Dr. Monteague," she began, her gaze steady. "Did you by chance take any photographs of the artifact before Dr. Harrington's death?" Monteague blinked, surprised by the question, but there was no hesitation in her response. "Yes, I did. As part of the documentation process, would it be possible to see them?" Agatha asked, her tone polite yet insistent. Monteague hesitated, her gaze wary, but something in Agatha's calm, assured demeanor seemed to reassure her. After a moment, she nodded. "I have them in my cabin, wait here." Monteague returned moments later, a small leather-bound notebook in hand. Inside were several photographs, each carefully annotated. Agatha took them, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail of the idol, the intricate carvings, the weathered texture of the stone, the faint traces of something ancient and otherworldly that seemed to emanate from the pictures themselves. She studied them closely, each image pulling her deeper into the mystery. Was this truly the idol of Kadesh, or was it something else entirely? And if it was, why had someone gone to such lengths to protect it? The questions piled up, each one leading her down a darker, more complex path. The subtle weathering of the idol, the distinct mark etched into its base, was undeniably fascinating. Agatha murmured to herself, her fingers gently tracing the worn contours of the artifact. "And yet what is it?" Monteague asked, her voice tinged with unease as she watched Agatha's careful examination. Agatha's response came swiftly as she reached into her handbag and retrieved a neatly folded handkerchief. With deliberate precision, she unfolded it, revealing a small figure, the idol that had been recovered from Harrington's cabin. She set it beside the photograph Monteague had provided and leaned in, her voice low but resolute. "This is not the same artifact." Monteague's breath hitched, her eyes darting between the two objects. "Are you certain?" she asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. "Quite," Agatha replied, her tone firm and unwavering. "The markings are different, the details are less precise. This is a replica, and a poor one at that." Monteague's face paled, the weight of the realization settling heavily upon her. Agatha's words cut through the air with chilling clarity. "Then the real artifact is missing," she finished, "and likely the key to this entire mystery." The train's gentle rocking continued as it sped through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels amplifying the tension in the small compartment. Agatha felt the gravity of her discovery pressing upon her, each click of the wheels underscoring the fact that the idol switch had not been an accident. It had been deliberate, calculated, and connected to Harrington's death. Whoever had orchestrated this was not just trying to cover their tracks. They had underestimated Agatha Marple, with the hum of the train as her only companion. Agatha's mind raced as she moved toward the luggage car, her footsteps silent against the thick carpet. The weight of the revelation about the idol gnawed at her thoughts, each step drawing her closer to a truth she knew would be fraught with danger. As she stepped into the dimly lit luggage car, the air seemed to shift. The faint scent of polished wood and leather mixed with the cold, metallic tang of steel, and the space seemed to grow unnervingly still. Stacks of trunks and suitcases loomed like silent sentinels, their forms casting long eerie shadows beneath the dim overhead light. Agatha paused, her sharp eyes scanning the narrow space, her instincts screaming that she was not alone. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a presence that was not quite visible but unmistakably real, made her heart quicken. Agatha's expression remained calm, but her senses were heightened, every part of her mind alert. She stepped forward, her gloved hand brushing against the edge of a trunk, the faintest of sounds, a footfall perhaps, echoing behind her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady, carrying the weight of authority. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the train speeding through the night. Then came the unmistakable creak of a door swinging shut, followed by the sudden flicker and dimming of the overhead light. The car plunged into shadow, and Agatha's mind raced. Whoever was there intended to trap her. The heavy door to the corridor had been pulled shut with a decisive click, the lock snapping into place. "Ah," Agatha murmured under her breath, a dry amusement coloring her voice despite the situation. How thoughtful. The shadows seemed to close in as she cautiously moved deeper into the car, her senses acutely tuned to every minute detail. She could feel the chill of the night air seeping through the thin walls of the train, the faint rustle of fabric to her left a subtle warning that she was not alone. The assassin, or whoever was waiting, was hoping she would panic, hoping she would make herself an easy target. But Agatha Marple did not panic. She moved with deliberate calm, each step measured, her mind as sharp as ever. The game had shifted, and Agatha was determined to win it. Agatha's breath remained steady, her senses sharp as ever. The figure in the shadows moved with eerie precision, darting from the dark like a spectre. A fleeting image of a figure cloaked in dark fabric, their face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, flashed through her mind. The figure lunged, but Agatha had anticipated the move, her instincts razor-sharp. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped, her small frame surprisingly agile for her age. The assailant's shoulder collided with a towering stack of luggage, sending a cascade of trunks crashing to the floor. The noise reverberated through the narrow car, muffling Agatha's swift retreat toward the door. Her fingers found the lock, fumbling briefly in the chaos before twisting it open with a determined snap. The door creaked as it swung ajar, and a sliver of light from the corridor beyond spilled into the darkened room. With a final glance toward the shadowed figure, Agatha slipped through, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it in one fluid motion. She paused for a moment, her pulse still steady, and as if the danger had never been, she turned to see the steward approaching. His startled eyes met hers. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with concern, "are you quite all right?" Agatha straightened, adjusting her hat with the ease of someone who had seen far worse. Her composure never faltered. "Quite, thank you," she replied with a polite smile, "though I suggest you alert the conductor. There's someone in the luggage car who shouldn't be there." The steward's face drained of color, but he nodded quickly, hurrying off to execute her instructions. Agatha stood in the corridor for a brief moment, her mind calculating, piecing together the fragments of what had just transpired. The attempt on her life, she realized, confirmed a crucial detail: the murderer knew she was closing in on the truth. A faint, knowing smile tugged at her lips as she adjusted her gloves and turned to walk back toward her compartment. The game had taken a dark turn, but Agatha Marple had no intention of backing down. Her resolve had only strengthened. The shadows on this train were deep, but she was determined to bring each and every one of them to the light. The dining car, when she entered, was unnervingly quiet. The usual murmur of conversation had died away, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The passengers sat in still, rigid postures, their eyes darting toward the far end of the car, where the conductor stood beside Dr. Evelyn Monteague. Monteague's face was pale, her posture resolute, a stark contrast to the whispers of accusation swirling around her. Agatha took a seat near the back of the car, her eyes narrowing as she observed the scene. The conductor held up a small glass vial, its contents barely visible, a faint residue clinging to the bottom. "I regret this, Dr. Monteague," the conductor said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment, "but the evidence is compelling. This vial was found in your medical kit." "That is absurd," Monteague snapped, her voice firm. "I do not deny it's mine, but it's standard for a physician to carry such items. That does not make me a murderer." A low murmur rippled through the gathered passengers, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion hanging thick in the air. Agatha, still seated with a knitting needle in hand, watched with keen interest. Her thoughts, as ever, cut through the growing tension like a blade. "Compelling evidence, perhaps," Agatha spoke at last, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority that silenced the room. "But circumstantial, nonetheless." All eyes turned to her as she rose, the weight of her words hanging in the air, like a challenge. Agatha Marple's demeanor remained unshaken as she faced the conductor, her posture calm, but commanding. "Tell me, Mr. Conductor," she began, stepping forward with quiet authority, "was this vial discovered in plain view?" The conductor hesitated, his eyes darting nervously before he answered. "It was found during a routine check of Dr. Monteague's belongings." Agatha's tone sharpened, her gaze unwavering. "Indeed," she said, pausing for effect, "and yet if I were inclined to commit such a crime, I would not leave such an incriminating item in my own possession, let alone where it could be so easily discovered." "Would you?" The weight of her words hung in the air, and Monteague's eyes flickered with something akin to gratitude as the murmurs around the car shifted. The suspicion that had once clung to her now had an undertone of doubt. The conductor, visibly unsettled by the turn of events, cleared his throat. "The matter is serious, Miss Marple. It is not merely conjecture." Agatha's response was smooth and deliberate. "Precisely why conjecture should not lead to a hasty conclusion, Mr. Conductor. If you wish to solve this crime, I suggest we look beyond the surface." Later, Agatha found solace in the quiet sanctuary of the observation car. The faint glow of lanterns danced off the polished glass, casting long shadows against the impenetrable darkness outside. Her mind raced, a labyrinth of possibilities weaving together as she considered every angle of the case. She wasn't alone for long. Sir Julian Blake, a glass of brandy in hand and a curious glint in his eyes, approached her with an air of quiet intrigue. "Miss Marple," he said, easing into the seat across from her, "you do have a talent for creating doubt." Agatha's expression remained mild, though her voice was steady. "It is a talent born of necessity," she replied. "Doctor, Monteague is not the only one on this train with secrets, after all." Blake's lips twitched into a knowing smile. "Harrington, you mean?" Agatha nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I suspect he had quite a few." Blake's face darkened at the mention of the late Dr. Harrington. "You suspect correctly," Agatha said, her tone light but pointed. "Tell me, Sir Julian, were you aware of Dr. Harrington's creative tendencies?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "Creative?" Agatha's gaze remained fixed. "Let's say he had a penchant for acquiring artifacts of questionable authenticity," she said carefully, "and for inflating their value through less than honest means." Blake's expression grew more serious, the shadows of his own involvement flickering at the edge of his thoughts. "A genius in his field," he murmured, "but always with an eye for the dramatic and the lucrative." Agatha nodded thoughtfully, her mind piecing together the pieces of the puzzle. "Such practices create enemies," she said quietly. don't you think? Rivals, creditors, even accomplices who might have felt slighted. Blake fell into a contemplative silence, swirling his brandy. His gaze turned distant, lost in thought. Agatha's mind sharpened with clarity. Harrington's forgeries were not mere academic missteps. They were the seeds of deeper resentment, perhaps even murder. But who among the passengers had both the motive and the means to end his life? The answer came to her later, in the form of Madame Duo's luggage. Agatha had waited patiently for the right moment, slipping quietly into Duo's cabin while the woman was occupied elsewhere. The room, as expected, was a reflection of its occupant, richly patterned fabrics, the faintest trace of expensive perfume lingering in the air, but it was the heavy trunk near the foot of the bed that captured Agatha's attention. With practiced hands she moved swiftly and quietly, her thoughts focused entirely on the contents hidden within. Every moment seemed to stretch as she worked, the silence around her amplifying the stakes of what she might find. Agatha's fingers were nimble, her movements practiced and efficient as she worked swiftly through the trunk's concealed compartment. Her expertise with such hidden compartments gave her an advantage, and after a subtle press along the trunk's side, a hidden panel gave way, revealing its secrets. Inside, she found a vial identical to the one previously planted in Dr. Montague's medical kit, a chilling discovery that sent a quick shiver of realization through her. But it was the sheath of letters alongside the vial that truly caught her attention. The name Roland Vassar stood out, a notorious dealer in stolen artifacts whose presence on the train had been nothing but a distant suspicion, until now. Agatha's heart quickened as she scanned the incriminating letters. They outlined secret negotiations for a valuable idol, promises of payment upon its delivery, and veiled threats should anything interfere with the deal. It was clear now Madame Dubois had been in cahoots with Vassar, and she had every reason to silence Dr. Harrington before he could expose her illicit dealings. Agatha carefully replaced the items, her mind racing as she exited the cabin. There was no doubt in her mind now, Dubois was at the heart of this twisted conspiracy. But as always, the next move would be critical. Dubois, for all her cunning, had underestimated one crucial factor, the resolve of Agatha Marple. The grand salon car of the Orient Express, as the train neared its final stop, shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a soft golden glow, the velvet upholstery rich and inviting, and the brass railings gleamed in the light, though the tension in the air was palpable. The passengers sat in hushed anticipation, their faces pale in the warm glow of the room. At the center of it all stood Agatha Marple, her small frame framed by the grand windows that blurred the moonlit hills beyond. With quiet precision, she adjusted her gloves, her eyes scanning the room. Before she spoke, her voice calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we find ourselves nearing the conclusion of a most unfortunate affair. The murder of Dr. Harrington, while tragic, was not without logic or purpose. Tonight I intend to lay bare the truth." A murmur rippled through the room as Agatha's words sunk in. Madame Dubois sat poised, her hands elegantly folded in her lap, though her face betrayed only mild curiosity. Sir Julian Blake fidgeted with his cufflinks, and Dr. Montague's steely gaze flickered between relief and wariness. Agatha's voice rang out once again. "The key to this mystery," she continued, "is the artifact Dr. Harrington so proudly displayed, or rather what he claimed to display. For, as I discovered, the idol found in his cabin was a forgery, a fact far more significant than I originally realized." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the tense room. "The forgery, you see, was no accident. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to divert suspicion and pave the way for a far more lucrative scheme." Madame Dubois' smile faltered, her knuckles tightening against the plush armrests of her chair. Agatha stepped forward, her gaze locking on the woman who had so carefully hidden her sins. From the beginning, the so-called curse surrounding the idol was a smokescreen, a tale crafted to instill fear and mislead the curious. And who better to exploit such superstition than you, Madame Dubois? The room collectively inhaled, the air thick with anticipation. Madame Dubois's composure cracked for a split second, but she recovered swiftly, her cool laugh ringing out. "Miss Marple," she said with a sharp icy tone, "I'm afraid your imagination has run wild." Madame Dubois's face tightened, her lips curling into a forced smile as she straightened her back, trying to maintain an air of indifference. "Run away with you?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "What possible motive could I have?" Agatha's eyes gleamed with the quiet confidence of someone who had already pieced together the final fragments of a puzzle. Her lips curved into a faint but knowing smile. "Every motive, Madame Dubois," she replied smoothly, her voice never wavering. "Dr. Harrington's history of acquiring and selling artifacts of questionable provenance was well known, but you saw an opportunity to turn his habits to your advantage. The artifact, genuine and priceless, was switched with a forgery before the journey even began. The real idol was meant to be delivered to Roland Vassar in Paris, and your correspondence with him, hidden carefully in your luggage, revealed the plan quite clearly." Madame Dubois's composure faltered slightly, though she remained silent, her expression hardening into a mask of defiance. Agatha pressed on, her tone unwavering. "And the murder? It wasn't merely a crime of opportunity, it was a necessary evil, something to ensure the truth would never come to light. Dr. Harrington's boastfulness made him vulnerable. Poison, hidden in a vial identical to the one in Dr. Mond's medical kit, was used to silence him during dinner. Conveniently, it shifted the suspicion onto Dr. Mond's. Sir Julian Blake, pale but still incredulous, leaned forward. "But the vial, wasn't it found in Dr. Mond's belongings?" he asked. Agatha inclined her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile crossing her face. Indeed, it was planted there by Madame Dubois herself. The locked doors of the train made it all too easy to frame someone else, particularly a colleague with a clear motive to resent Dr. Harrington. Mon exhaled sharply, her stiff posture relaxing just a touch for the first time that evening. Agatha's voice rang out with finality. "And the relic's supposed curse? It was the perfect cover, a smokescreen, a tale to invoke fear and mislead the curious. Who would ever suspect such careful, calculated greed when a curse could bear the blame?" The train slowed as it approached its next stop, a quiet station bathed in flickering gaslight, and the atmosphere inside the salon car thickened with anticipation. Madame Dubois, her face pale but composed, rose as the train's conductor entered the room, flanked by a pair of uniformed officers. "You've no proof," she said, her voice as cold as ice. Agatha, unruffled, met her gaze squarely. "On the contrary," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Your letters to Vassar, the hidden vial of poison, and the forgery itself are proof enough. Justice doesn't require a confession, only evidence." The officers moved in, escorting Madame Dubois from the room as the remaining passengers watched in stunned silence. Agatha returned to her seat, her knitting lying untouched. The familiar clack of her needles filled the silence as the train resumed its journey, the tension beginning to dissipate. Sir Julian Blake approached her, his face a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Miss Marple, how did you piece it all together?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Agatha looked up at him, her smile faint but satisfied. "Observation, Sir Julian," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet assurance, and a habit of noticing what others overlook. Greed and ambition have a way of revealing themselves, even when one tries to hide them. As the train neared Paris, Agatha gazed out at the approaching city lights, her thoughts still lingering on the case. The ordeal had ended, but the lessons it carried would not fade easily. The human heart, she mused, was capable of both brilliance and folly, and it was her task to untangle the two. With a final glance at the remaining passengers, each now carrying their own truths, Agatha resumed her knitting. The train rumbled on, leaving behind a trail of secrets, lies and justice served.